Hello, my name is Richard Peña. I'm a professor of film studies at Columbia University. I'm here at the Quad Cinema in New York, and I'm going to introduce the film Intolerance by D.W. Griffith for Cohen Media Channel. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this particular film. To talk about Intolerance, you have to talk about its creator, D.W. Griffith. Rarely has a film been so closely tied to the life, the vision, the history of its maker. In this case, Griffith was someone who, as I'm sure you know, was one of the great pioneers of film art. He began making films in 1908, and by 1912 had really assumed a level of mastery and a position of great respect even within what was still a fledgling American industry. At that point, he left American Biograph, the company he had worked for from the very beginning, and moved to California, where he was going to strike out on his own. He actually took a full-page ad out in Variety where he said, D.W. Griffith, the inventor of the close-up, of parallel action, and named all these things. He frankly didn't invent any of them, but he used all of them extremely well. So in a sense, he was more of a virtuoso than an inventor. But all of this work led to his finally making in 1914 The Birth of a Nation, a film which in a sense is not only a great masterpiece of cinema, but of course also a horribly racist work that would require another kind of discussion. For the moment, let me just say that that film completely transformed American cinema. It made American cinema from what had been a series of cottage industries into a big national industry, and really helped create the means by which the American cinema, especially the Hollywood commercial cinema, went on not only to dominate the United States, but to dominate the rest of the world. Again, a film of enormous importance and made with astonishing technical skill. It was also a film that was wildly successful beyond anyone's imagination for how much money a film could bring in. And the film brought in quite a lot of money for D.W. Griffith, who, aside from its director and writer, was also its producer. But at the same time, because the film is this horribly racist tract, the film was attacked. Perhaps not as vociferously as it might have been, but there are many people who wrote against it and picketed the film and things like that. And in a strange way, Griffith felt really offended by that. I mean, he himself, being a Southerner perhaps, felt that he was just telling the truth about what had gone on in the South. But more than that, he felt people were being intolerant of his opinions. So his next project was a film that he labeled Intolerance. That it was about, as he saw it, 4 cases of intolerance in history. And he was going to bring these stories together. The first was, again, a completely invented story set in ancient Babylon about the sort of battle between Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the emperor of Babylon, and the priestly caste who wanted him to sort of rein in the populace and have them spend more time worshiping idols and whatever. The second story, which runs a little bit almost like a backbeat through the film, is the Christ story. Christ stories were enormously popular in the silent era. There are literally dozens and dozens of Christ stories made, and this is Griffith's own version in a way. The third story is what he calls the medieval story. It's actually the story of the St. Bartholomew Days massacre, in which the French Catholic authorities massacred thousands of French Protestants. And the fourth story is what he called the modern story. And it's a story set in the 20th century that starts off with industrial strife and then goes into the consequences of too much sort of social engineering. And again, it's kind of a remarkable sort of story about intolerance in the modern era. Griffith not only shot these 4 films, each of which really could be a film on its own, but then he decided to edit them together, so that, in fact, we move from one story to the other within this sort of overall complex that is Intolerance. So we move from ancient Babylon to the modern story, back to the Christ story, back to the French Huguenots, back to the Babylon. It's an extraordinarily ambitious work, and of course, within each story there are subplots, so we're moving between those subplots at the same time. The film, in many ways, is kind of the distillation or the explosion, the evolution of a style that Griffith had begun with in his early silent films of parallel action. Action going on at the same time in two different places and going back and forth between those sort of two sets of action. Only now Griffith is doing it among four stories and among stories within each of the stories. So it's an enormously ambitious project. The film was magnificent in many ways. I mean, the sets from Babylon were historical in the sense that they kind of really marked an epic. Even today, I think we compare set design to what was being done in 1916 because the work was so extraordinary in many ways. The action, the editing, the performances are all wonderful in the film. It's really a very astonishing work in lots of ways, and unfortunately it was also a failure. All the money, or much of the money, that Griffith had made for Birth of a Nation, he lost in Intolerance. And he kept on trying to salvage it, trying to do different versions. He split apart the modern story and released it as a film called The Mother and the Law. Did what he could, but in essence, that film almost sealed the fate of Griffith as a filmmaker. Really, for the rest of his life, he was paying off debts that he incurred during Intolerance. So it becomes really one of the great, perhaps the first great, mad project of cinema, that a director puts all his resources into a film that is highly, highly personal, that really is for him a self-defense of what he's trying to do, but beyond those particular reasons makes this truly remarkable vision of humanity and the way that humanity has progressed, or not so much, over the centuries. The film remains a kind of monument to Griffith's artistry, to his vision. The fact that it was a failure is sad in a way. In many ways, I think it's a much greater film than Birth of a Nation, even more complex, even more technically challenging, but in a way also the film that to a certain extent helped end the career of D.W. Griffith. He would continue making films for another 14, 15 years, but after Intolerance, somehow he never, I think, really reached that level of artistry that he had so evidenced in this and Birth of a Nation. So that's the story of Intolerance. I know that you will enjoy the film. The version you're going to see is the most restored version possible, because Griffith himself cut into the negative to make various versions that he hoped would be profitable. It's very hard to come up with the definitive version of Intolerance. It's a film that was always changing, and indeed there's a famous story of Griffith at the Museum of Modern Art where he gave or sold his films and then worked on them for a number of years, restoring them, that Iris Barry, the original curator, said, "Mr. Griffith, I see you're working on Intolerance. Is it just as it was when it came out?" And Griffith said, "Oh no, now it's much better." So indeed, even the 1930s, it seems, he continued to work on the film, continued to sort of change things. So whatever we have of Intolerance is whatever version Griffith might have left us, whether or not it's the absolute original. But it doesn't matter. It's a monument. And certainly, I think, perhaps not only a monument to Griffith, but really a kind of great symbol of the level of artistic ambition that already in 1916 an artist could have with a medium that was at that point just 20 years old. I'm Richard Peña. I'm a professor of film studies at Columbia University, and for the Cohen Media Channel, I say welcome, and I know you'll enjoy this great landmark of world cinema, Intolerance.